Okay, hi everybody. So thank you for attending this panel on Canadian comics and glams. My name is Meaghan Scanlon and I'll be your moderator today. So just to go over the housekeeping bit first, this is a roundtable that will begin with the panelists in conversation, and there will be time for questions from the audience throughout, really. I think post a question whenever you feel like it. The Zoom chat window is open to post your comments and questions, and it's been really active so far, so let's keep that going. You can also use the raise hand button during the Q&A if you want to speak out loud. The session is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube following the symposium, and we'll be sending a follow-up email next week with all the information. And any links posted in the chat will be saved to a resource document that we'll send out after the symposium. And please, if you ask a question, try and keep it brief and on topic. Okay. So for anybody who's not familiar with the GLAM acronym, it stands for Galleries, Libraries, Archives, and Museums. Nothing to do with glam rock, sorry. If you were expecting us to talk about David Bowie, that is not this panel. Okay. So I think it probably doesn't hurt for me to give a basic definition of all the different types of institutions, especially because I sometimes get the feeling people are not really clear on the difference between archives and libraries. So a museum generally collects physical objects. A gallery is a museum that focuses on works of art. A library collects published material. So that's anything made available to the public in multiple copies, including books, DVDs, or music recordings. And an archives collects unpublished material like letters, manuscripts, and business records. So obviously published comics themselves fall under the collecting scope of libraries. But a creator's original artwork or scripts or a publisher's records would be considered archival material. And of course, comics incorporate both text and visual art, so there may be an interest there for galleries as well. To add another wrinkle, older comics in particular, as we know, can be quite rare. So when libraries do have collections, they tend to fall under the umbrella of a special collections department. That is the part of the library that deals with rarer materials that require special storage and security conditions. And often, especially in academic libraries, special collections are paired with archives. So basically, comics fit in a lot of places in glams. And today we're going to discuss the role of glams in preserving Canadian comics heritage. So we're going to start by all of us, thank you, Julia. We're going to start by introducing ourselves and giving some background on why we're here. And I'll just go first. So as I said, my name is Meaghan Scanlon. I've been a special collections librarian at Library and Archives Canada since 2010. My job there entails working with LAC's rare book collection, which includes two significant collections of Canadian comics, namely the John Bell collection and the Bell Features collection. I've been interested in comics for a long time. When I was doing my library science degree, I worked them into as many of my assignments as I could. So I was quite happy when I got to LAC and found these great collections waiting for me. A few comics projects I've done at LAC. I curated an exhibition called Alter Ego, Comics and Canadian Identity, which ran at LAC in 2016, and then again at the Toronto Public Library in 2018. I created a detailed finding aid for the Bell Features collection. And by the way, I'm getting the sense that people don't know maybe that the Bell Features collection is fully digitized in conjunction with the Alter Ego exhibition that was done. And I'm going to post a link in the chat for people to find the links to the digital comics. I'm now working away at getting the John Bell collection fully described. And back in 2016, I was able to interview John about his collection for an episode of the LAC podcast, which we'll also, I guess, post a link to in the chat. I think comics present a bit of a descriptive challenge for traditional library catalogs, and one of my personal main interests is how we can get more useful metadata about our collections online for users. So that's me, and now I'll pass it on to the next person, and on my screen, the next person is Lucia. So, hello, Lucia.
Hi, thank you, Meaghan. Thank you for the invitation for this panel. So I work as an assistant professor, limited duties instructor, so part-time at the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western, and sometimes also at the iSchool U of T. I teach and do research on reading, comics, teens and teen media and public libraries. And On my doctoral work years ago, there were some conversations about readers and reading in some of the previous panels. And I have not done historical research on reading, but since my doctoral research was in 2010, maybe it's starting to get the historical status. So I interview 17 comic readers in London, Ontario about their reading practices around comics, and kind of like trying to know a little bit more about comics as reading material and less about cultural objects or part of a fandom identity. After that work, I've been working on comics and libraries, and I've been teaching since 2010 a course on the presence and the work of comics in libraries. And recently, I'll just put it also on the chat, my last project was in collaboration with Nicole Dalmer at McMaster on a project funded by the American Library Association on seniors' visual representation of older age in illustrated materials. So I'll pop that later. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. And I see on my screen next up, Joe.
Okay. Hi, I'm Joe. I'm a cartoonist. I did a calculation today and I realized I've been working for 38 years. I have 8 books in print. I was nominated for the Governor General's Award yesterday for my recent book, so I'm sort of bragging about that because it's the first time a graphic novel has been in the adult literature category. So I don't think that my book is the greatest book in the world, but I'm glad that there's a comic in there with the book. So I'm incredibly grateful. I co-curated a show of indie comics at the Art Gallery of Hamilton, I think in 2019. That's probably why I'm here today. It was 47 artists all from all across Canada, and it was I got to see I visited a lot of studios. I saw a lot of conditions of people's archives and the bad condition of some of their archives. So I have a bit of insight on that. That's about it. I love comics and I love anything that I can do to promote comics. So yeah, I'm just glad to be here talking about comics with you guys.
Very cool, thank you. And yeah, you should brag about it.
Definitely.
Pretty impressive. Okay, next up, Mark.
Hi, thanks for having me here. I think I'm a little bit different than everybody else. I've sort of been on all sides of this desk. I'm primarily a comic book creator and former publisher. I created Northgard, co-created with Gabrielle Morissette, co-created Northgard and Anglo-Man, and I ran this small press comic company, Matrix Comics, which and also published the book Canuck Comics, A History of Canadian Comics by John Bell in 1986. So at the same time, I was also a participant in John Bell's museum show at the Canadian Museum of Caricature, Guardians of the North, which later became an online exhibit on the LAC's website. And then Meaghan kindly included Northgard and Anglo-Man in Alter Ego in 2016, which was wonderful. So, and just coincidentally, I've gone back to school recently to study librarianship and become a library technologist. So right now I'm just studying archiving and libraries and all of that. So it's, so I can see it from the other side of the table as well. So hopefully I can bring a slightly different perspective from that point of view.
Great, thanks, Mark. Okay, and next up, Deborah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Deb Merritt-Williston, and I'm Special Collections Librarian for Rare Books at Archives and Special Collections, Western Libraries, Western University. So I actually come to this panel without a lot of comic book knowledge and expertise, but I do come to it with expertise and knowledge of special collections and working in libraries with many different types of material and trying to overcome the challenges. Meaghan talked a little bit about those in libraries of cataloging our comic books. Western has a very large collection of comic books that started off with a donation by Eddie Smep several years ago. That donation continues to grow, and we've also received other significant donations from local collectors. So we estimate to have about 50,000 plus comic books in our collection, a lot of rare comic books. And we're just poised right now to start turning these donations into a significant academic collection. And there's a lot of challenges with that, but there's also a lot of opportunities. So I'm here to both share, Eddie's here. Hello, Eddie. And I'm here today to both sort of share my ideas about how we might approach this at Western, collaborate with other institutions, not just with our current collection, but how we continue to build on it, move forward, collaborating with donors, collaborating with local shops, collaborating with other institutions, and then also to learn. I hope that I can learn a lot from all the different perspectives on this panel today. So thank you.
Great, thanks. And last but not least, we have Rick.
Thanks, Megan. Hi, everyone. I'm Rick Stapleton. I'm the head of the Archives and Research Collections Department at McMaster University Library. I was invited to be on this panel by Ivan, who became aware of the fact that we've been thinking about starting to collect in the area of Canadian comics. It would be a brand new collecting area for us. So he asked me to talk about that. And I'd just like to take a quick minute just to explain what it is that we've decided to focus on in our collecting area. And in particular, we've decided to focus on the archives of Canadian cartoonists who create the longer graphic narratives. And the way we came to that decision was that, well, whenever we think about a new collecting area, we consider a few factors. One of them being, does it fit with what we currently do? Or is it a huge stretch for us? And where we saw a fit with cartoonist archives is in the area of Canadian literary papers. So we have the archives of a lot of Canadian authors, some very well known, some lesser known, and we saw, that this connection with the graphic narrative. Why wouldn't we want to collect the archives of Canadian cartoonists, particularly since the narrative is growing in such stature and popularity, as evidenced by Joe's nomination for the GG Award. Congrats, Joe. So that was one of the factors that shaped our decision. Another question is just to ask, can we responsibly take care of this stuff? Or can we be good stewards? Which doesn't just mean acquiring it. It also means describing it, promoting it, preserving it, of course, and making it available to researchers. And we decided, yeah, we can do this. We have a track record for many other collections, but we also assume that we wouldn't be the only archives in Canada wanting to collect in this area, in the same way that we're not the only archive collecting literary papers. So that was another factor. And the third was, as a university library, we do have a responsibility to support research and scholarship, both at McMaster and beyond. And would this do that? And we thought, yes, it would. If, and to give one example is that at McMaster, the English department now offers a course in the Canadian graphic narrative, taught by Lorraine York, who was in the previous session, and I think might be in on this one as well, attending. So we are supporting that mission, and so those were the factors in our decision. It's a brand new collecting area for us. We have talked to a few cartoonists, and but it is new. But I am pleased to announce, with his permission, that Ho-Che Anderson is donating his early archive to us. Yeah, thanks, Joe. Joe recommended Ho-Che to us, and we're very pleased about that. So that's all for me at the moment. Thanks.
Well, that's exciting. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lots of excitement in the chat area. Okay, so to get our discussion started, oops, I'm losing my cursor. To get our discussion started, Lucia was kind enough to share the research questions that she used to develop her proposal for this conference. And I thought that, well, I think we all agreed that they would make a good starting point, and we'll just, start there and see where the discussion goes. And of course, we'll be happy to take questions, as I mentioned before. So Lucia's questions are as follows. 1, how are the history and memory of Canadian comics made, preserved, and disseminated? Who have been the key actors in their construction and establishment? 2, what has been the role of Glam institutions in this process? And what could or should be based on resources, needs, training, etc. 3, how could or should Glam institutions collaborate amongst themselves and with other actors, including creators, publishers, comic stores, collectors, etc., to develop processes of canon production, curation, and conservation that are inclusive and representative of the richness and complexity of the Canadian comics market and history? So, because Lucia was the one who came up with the questions, we're going to make her get us started on the discussion. So, go to it, Lucia.
Yes. So I think that the way I'm going to start this is it's kind of like doing an act of humility, because it's kind of I'm still started in this process, and probably you can tell because of the breadth of the questions and partly my project. I'm thinking I was thinking very, very highly that I could start doing a historiography of Canadian comics and start doing kind of like a history of the history. And then I started kind of like pulling threads, and I'm like, this isn't like, I cannot do this. I'm a part-time instructor, so research is not kind of part of my mandate. So I started looking more at the institutions that kind of interest me because of my own training, and those are libraries, archives, museums. So I would say that I come to this research with a lot of curiosity and a lot of respect. The curiosity comes from the fact that I am not Canadian. I'm an immigrant settler. I did not grow up in Canada. I did not grow up reading any of the titles that people mentioned, or I was not aware of them. When I was in Spain, I was an avid reader, or I'm still an avid reader of European, Spanish, especially, and American comics, some manga. And it was not until I moved to Canada that suddenly I started discovering that some people that I read actually were Canadian. And that there was such a thing as Canadian comics. So this is my part of kind of coming with an eagerness to learn. And the second part of respect, it comes from kind of the work that a lot of people has done already, and that I think we've all commented on the quality and the thoughtfulness of all the participants this morning. So it's kind of a respect for the work that Meaghan has done already on the connection between Canadian comics and archives and preservation and how to share. Amy Wright in the morning has also done a bunch of work there. Probably some of you have seen Matthew Murray popping up in the chats, that he also has some work on comics in Canada. Evidently, John Bell, and then in Quebec, Michel Biot or Mira Falardeau. More specifically, kind of like talking how libraries have helped. My list right now is going to sound a little bit of name dropping, but I want to give credit to some folks that have been working on this, and also for those of you that maybe are not aware that these collections exist, that they're out there for you to see. I mean, we have Deborah here with the Western Collection. But for example, Andrew this morning was mentioning the one at Ryerson, that Olivia Wong and Alison Skirm, that I've seen them kind of in previous panels too, that they've organized and made available already for the Canadian whites. Chelsea's River has been doing also a brilliant work at UBC, where on their ephemera collection, they've been focusing on Vancouver-based artists whose work is also primarily about Vancouver. So that kind of connects with Rick's idea of you have to choose something that you can do and that maps well to your collection. Also, we'd like to mention Camille Callison that initiated and has done a brilliant and much necessary work with the Massachusetts Indigenous Graphic Novels collection at the University of Manitoba. Finally, unless we were talking in the previous panel a little bit, I think Matthew was mentioning about the fact that sometimes folks don't want to share their especially in scenes, their product with institutions. They don't want to see them preserve or being part of those places. And I think that's kind of sometimes what propels initiatives like the one from Rotema Diamant that I think she's going to present tomorrow, and the Canadian Comics Open Library, and kind of doing a project that it's a nonprofit, very much volunteer, grassroots organized, and that it's sometimes more invited for creators that might be hesitant of that institutional kind of power, if I must say. I think I'm going to leave it like that, because I have kind of like a lot of notes, and I know that a lot of things are going to pop up, and here I really am very intrigued what everybody else is. I love Joe's exhibit, and I want to hear more about his like archives visits and things like that. So I hope that one of the things that I wanted to make sure to do is kind of like mentioning all the folks out there that have been doing collection work for comics.
If I could jump in for a sec, because I think I can follow up here. I've had the experience of having my work, or Gabrielle Morissette's artwork, purchased or collected by LAC. So, you know, and I have to say, just as a creator, the sense of relief and affirmation that you get from having your work put in a collection is enormous, because, you know, until the 80s, there really was nothing like this except LAC's collection, which went back to the 70s. And your work was, you know, there was nowhere to put it. And, you know, as time goes on and it's kept in your own home, the quality degrades. You're not keeping it under good conditions. You know, you're afraid it will be lost to history. And this sense of historic, you know, the sense that just the sense of historical importance of your work is enormous when your work is placed in a collection. I could say that it, you know, it could be easier, because I just had an argument with a friend of mine earlier in the week who's a political cartoonist who was just on the verge of throwing away all his original cartoons. And all of us online went, no, don't do that. There are archives. And he really didn't even, he only sort of vaguely knew that the archives existed, or the mechanism by which he could contact them. So I think on that score, if they were more if there was more general knowledge about them and more transparency, I think that would help an enormous amount. I also just want, as an aside, wanted to mention the early work of Robert McMillan, who had a show in I can't remember which, a small town in Ontario, at his local museum back in the late 80s. And it was one of the first ever museum gallery shows of dealing with Canadian comics that I ever participated in. And so I think his work should be recognized too.
I think that leads well into Joe, if you want to talk a bit about putting together This Is Serious and visiting studios and that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah. Our mandate, what we realized, what we wanted to, the kind of comics we wanted to cover, was what we decided to call indie comics, which I think started in the 80s. It has a lot of the same elements of indie film. It's like auteur work, and it's you know, personal narrative. That was kind of our thing. We weren't as interested in fantasy or superhero stuff, because we feel like that's been covered in other venues, like more commercial kind of thing. So the thing that I think, and Rick, you saying that you're interested in the work that is of that similar vein, I think that's what Canada is maybe best known for. Like when you think of indie comics and you think of the main people that began that comics being taken as serious literature are Canadians. And you have Julie Doucet, you have Seth, and you have Chester, and I'm forgetting someone else. I just think that that's Canada's really important contribution to comics. Like I think when Dave Collier perhaps as well. Anyway, I just visiting. We had a list of over 200 potential exhibitors for the show, which they told us we had to narrow down to 47. So that was hard, and we visited, I think, 25 different studios in Montreal, Toronto, and Hamilton, and the condition of people's archives were varied. Some people were very organized. They had flat files. Everything was at their fingertips, perfectly organized. But the majority were terrible. They were in damp boxes under old snowsuits and stuff. In the case of Dave Collier, who's a genius, but not an organized genius, I literally found pages that I needed to complete a story like in his sock drawer, and I put them together. So I was assembling and archiving this stuff for him. I think cartoonists are kind of humble people. They have an inferiority complex. So they would probably be hesitant to approach an archive. But if they knew that the archives were interested, they would probably be interested. As I was saying to Rick in a discussion we had earlier, one of the concerns might be some people are emotionally attached to their originals. The originals are a byproduct, really. The finished printed book is the product. The original art is a byproduct, but it's a byproduct that they've labored over for hundreds of hours. So there's sometimes an emotional attachment. Like for instance, Chester Brown, when he sells originals, he copies the page and sells the copy and keeps his original because he's very attached to his pages. And I want to know why he doesn't make a copy of the copy he's not emotionally attached to the copy of the copy. But anyway, there's also the financial consideration of cartoonists who are also very poor people, usually. So some people sell original art. They sell original art, and a lot of people, their income is dependent on that. So there's also that consideration. And then the other thing is that a lot of the younger people, and even some of the older cartoonists, are working entirely digital. And so there are no originals in a traditional sense. So that's another thing. And I think, Rick, you discussed that, of talking about digital archiving, which would be really an important thing as well, just to have it all organized and structured like that. I think that would be amazing. So yeah, that's all I think, unless there's anything else if anyone wants to ask me. Yeah.
Rick, you unmuted. Do you?
Yeah, I was just following up a little bit on what Joe was saying, that yeah, those who are working in a digital environment, those archives need to be preserved as well. And we are developing means by which we can do that at McMaster and elsewhere. So we would be interested in acquiring digital archives as well. As far as it's interesting, Joe, just hearing you talk, that you had 200 artists in mind and had to narrow it down to 47. That is another factor, is that we can intend to acquire cartoonist archives, but we can't acquire all of them. And even if all of the artists wanted to donate to us, we couldn't in good conscience acquire them all and take care of them responsibly. So that's another factor, is deciding who to approach, and we do rely on advice for that from people like Joe and others, and so that there's factors like that. The monetary side, yeah, and the emotional attachment. I often think I don't have any kind of personal archive that would ever need to be donated anywhere, but if I did, I would find it really hard to give it up, even though I'm asking people to give me theirs. I can understand the reluctance to let it go, or at least not until late in life. I can understand people wanting to keep things for a while. And monetarily, it's a challenge because our collection is built almost entirely these days on donations of archives, not on purchases. And I can appreciate where you know, if a cartoonist has an opportunity to sell parts of their collection, you know, and make have an income stream that way, I can fully understand that. And that's a challenge as well for collecting institutions. So so just a few observations there on things that Joe was saying.
Yeah, and I think John Bell talked about this a bit this morning about the resources issue that you really, I mean, people in the chat in the last session, we're talking a bit about legal deposit at LAC, and some of the, you know, people may not want to deposit their books or whatever, but legal deposit, generally speaking, is a very powerful collecting tool for LAC because certainly for bigger publishers, it's pretty much automatic. They send LAC 2 copies of every book they publish. But you know, that doesn't catch all, you know, indie comics, zines, etc. And you really, I think John, you know, what he said basically was you kind of need a dedicated, at least one dedicated person full-time. And I don't know how many libraries have a full-time comics librarian. It's not what I work on full-time. Yeah, Matthew in the chat says none. So I think, you know, the idea of working collaboratively, working cooperatively between institutions is a really important one. And I also think collectors are a key resource. You know, comics that has such a dedicated audience, which is really great. And people like John Bell and Eddie Smet are like the lifeblood of large collecting institutions, in my opinion. Like there's so much that we get from collectors who have spent, you know, their lives, you know, researching and collecting that, yeah, and it's a huge boon for libraries when these people, you know, come forward and want to donate or sell. I'm sure I had a point, but I think, yeah, the idea of working collaboratively and it like this gathering of, you know, creators, academics, information professionals, and independent researchers / often I think collectors, is a really great way for all of us to, you know, come together and think about how this can work. Like, how can we best document this material that we all love? I don't know, Rick, you look like you want to say something?
Oh, just on the something you said there just twigged for me. One thing we do offer, of course, to donors of collections is a tax credit for the appraised amount of the collection, which can be quite significant. So we have appraisers that we use for our collections in general. But I was just going to say, like, in terms of collaboration, if anyone out there knows of people qualified or have an expertise in appraising cartooning comics type collections, we'd love to hear about that. How about those people? You know, the appraisers we use are great, and they do have expertise in many areas, but if anyone knows of anyone who specializes in the appraisal of those other materials, we'd like to hear about it.
I can say from the creator's point of view that I understand that attachment to the original artwork. I'm a writer, so I didn't necessarily have that intense connection to the artwork because it was the artists, but I think I can say fairly from our perspective, it was actually a relief. It was actually a sense that we knew that the collection would be looked at, the art would be looked after, we would have access to it whenever we needed it, that was promised to us, and that we were no longer responsible for making sure that it was being maintained. I think that, you know, this way, I think for a lot of artists, it would be, you know, that they don't want their art in their underwear drawers, and they feel a sense. I mean, from my perspective, I felt a tremendous sense of relief that I would know that in 20 years I'd still be able to access this material if it was necessary.
Lucia, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to connect a couple of points that Rick and kind of Joe brought together, and from Matthew, sorry, also on the chat. The only comics librarian that I know of is Karen Green at Columbia, and most of the time when you tell people that she works at Columbia, everybody's like, oh yeah, it has to be Columbia, it has to be one Ivy League, it has to be one of those universities. But when you hear her story of how she started a collection and how she was named a comics librarian just a couple of years ago, because before she was sharing it with, she was doing antique history, and basically she was keeping tabs of her acquisitions on an Excel spreadsheet because there was no way of keeping tabs with things in it. Like, it sounded such a grassroots love, passion work that it's pretty amazing, and I would invite folks to read. I think a short story of her life in Comic Forum a couple of years ago won an Eisner. And if someone at an institution such as that one kind of had to fight that hard to start collections and to give comics a space and to find a way of making it a collection policy that was part of the budget and something that needed to be recognized, I think it speaks to the difficulty sometimes of getting this things rolling. And the other one, it's John mentioned it this morning, and Rick too, the problem of resources. And one of the things that you can get most librarians or most Glam professionals to agree on is the lack of money, the lack of staff, and the lack of time. And if we were, I used to work as a librarian, and even when I work as a librarian, if it were for us, we will take everything, we will catalog everything, and we would make everything available. But there's no bandwidth for that, and most budgets get cut, and especially staff. That is one of the most important things, and staff that has this knowledge. And on the previous panel, there was some talk about cultural policy, and I think that would be something important to make a point in Canadian policy, cultural policy, that actually there's something to preserve and to communicate in Canadian comics that needs support, and for that to perhaps make it all of us feel a little bit better. I would put the example of Belgium, that doesn't have such a policy, despite being one of the kind of like countries that supports comics and has a strongest comics history. And most people use the example of the comics museum in Brussels as an example of a place to visit, and they don't have a budget for purchases. So when something comes out on the private market, they cannot bid for it because they don't have the money to buy it. So if a country like that, where comics are idolized, respect, and have a spot in public opinion, I think it's incredible that we're doing this and that we're having this conversation, but I think it's also the realist in me says, let's just also think strategically of what might need to be done in the short term, the long term, and how to think about it in a way that especially would make it most importantly sustainable for the future. That would be my thing.
Yeah. So we had a question in the chat from Canada who said that ties into what you just said. So she says, this morning, John Bell said we should be working towards a network of institutions rather than a single repository for Canadian comics. What kinds of infrastructure would that involve? What would be the ideal way of organizing that if the resources were available? And this is something that I definitely started thinking about this morning as well. Okay, I'm not a cataloger by trade. But I recently heard a presentation at work from some of my colleagues who are investigating the potential of Wikidata. And I don't know if anybody here knows anything about that, but certainly I think, there are opportunities out there now with the internet for collective cataloging efforts to get as much metadata. Okay, so Matthew can talk about Wikidata and comics. I would like to hear that if you want to talk, Matthew. Yeah, I think, yes, collective cataloging, okay, should be something that is attainable, I hope. And is Allison Skirm in here? Because Allison, you, or she, if she's not here, catalog the Bell Features comics at X University. And I think did issue by issue rather than a traditional serials record. This was just something that I found really interesting because like I said before, I think the traditional library catalog does not serve comics that well. Well, some comics. So yeah, I think if we can, yeah, shared thinking about how to go about getting all this information out there. Oh, okay. Oh, here we go. In the chat, the Second World Comic as Data, North America Wikidata Editathon. Okay, well, that sounds exciting.
I can just talk about this a little bit. So this is done by Graphic Possibilities at Michigan State University, including their libraries and stuff. And they've been working on just linking things in their catalog, because they have a very large like Golden Age comics collection and other comics collection to Wikidata things. And so the first one that happened last fall was about creating Wikidata data entries for things like publishers, so that we knew, okay, linking the publisher in the catalog to the Wikidata entry. And so it's easier to be like, okay, I want to go to someone can go to Wikidata and then pull like every publication that was tied to it. It's still very much in development. But if you're interested about Wikidata, I really encourage you all to sign up for this thing that's happening next week and go check it out. They've got a really great, they have training stuff, and they have a really great like interface on the web for how to do this really easily. So I think it's a really neat thing. If someone wants to suggest to them, hey, let's do some Canadian specific stuff about this, I'm sure they'd be really into that as well.
I think that would be, yeah, I would like to see something like that for sure. Okay, and Amy says there is a metadata comics committee through the ALA Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable as well. Okay, so there is stuff out there.
I did a project for one of my professors on adding comic book specific terms like penciler, inker, letterer to the existing data structure.
Yeah, so I think I was just reading something about this too. I think from, it was on the Canada Comics Open Library website. They did a presentation at OLA about cataloging comics specifically, and they were talking about how with new descriptive standard RDA, there is more room for including more information, which is really good, because in the past, a record for a serial wouldn't even name the editor, much less the specific artist, which is so really not very useful for someone researching comics. Okay, I feel like maybe we're too far in the weeds on cataloging here. This might be too specific for a lot of people. Eddie Smet just joined us, yes, which is awesome. Okay, where should we go from here? So yes, oh, sure, yeah, so Candida pointed out in the chat that an idea of a collective comics catalog website would be maybe a good candidate to be funded by a SHRC partnership grant, which is certainly an interesting idea.
I was going to say, Meaghan, like not just that, but everything on the to-do list from today is the kind of thing. I know there's a whole experimental Canadian film SHRC partnership grant where it's like 5 years, multi-million dollars, case studies and community groups in each city to digitize and preserve experimental Canadian film. And that's the kind of massive project that SHRC does want to fund. But I said, I don't want to volunteer for it because I know how much work it is. And I know anyone who's done a SHRC application will probably feel their heart sinking. But it is the kind of thing that you could take a year to even prepare. But I do think that it's the kind of work that SHRC might want to fund. It's just there's so many different pieces that have to come into play with that, and we may not be there yet. But I just wanted to throw that out, that I do think that there could be funding. And I see that Jaylene's making comments about that too.
No, and I was going to mention this morning, I was chatting with Amy, and one of the things that we were also commenting is kind of replicating some of the things that maybe we've seen that have worked south of the border. And for example, the collaboration between the Library of Congress and SPX to have the archive. So it means that perhaps here you could look at try to work with BANCAF and TCAF, and sometimes with those kind of collaborations, you would be able to catch what Meaghan and John mentioned this morning, some of the artists and the items that perhaps are harder to find from main publishers, and kind of like broaden the collections that are represented in libraries too. And if I could suggest another thing out there, I think it would be, just from hearing everybody talking today, I think there's so many possibilities for oral history projects in Canadian comics history, so many. I know of large public library systems in the US that have managed to make that kind of like a local project for their city, for example, and make a local history, not of comics, but of other things, using public libraries as a repository. But I don't want to throw work on public libraries either. So just, yeah.
Yeah. Ivan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question for Rick and Deborah, and probably Joe. I know archives can preserve work, can make it available for research, and can house it. One of my concerns with archives is how they can get work such as graphic narrative back out in the community again and be connected with galleries. Deborah, I know that we've got an Eddie Smet presentation at the Words Festival coming up next month in London at the museum. That's one way. Joe, you got that exhibition done back in 2019, but you got that specifically from the studio work of the artists. And Rick, you have a beautiful gallery at MAC. Could there be any interaction between those two places and the Hamilton Art Gallery as well once you start acquiring this? Will be any impetus to go out in the community with this stuff rather than just keep it behind those library walls?
Absolutely. You mentioned the gallery. So at McMaster, we actually share a building with the McMaster Museum of Art. And we have a well-established relationship with them. And we do exhibit material from our collections there. I think it's about every year, or maybe every other year, we'll have an exhibit there. So that has a lot of potential. Meanwhile, our own exhibit area is fairly small, so we would rely on the museum for that. But you know, we also have dreams of having either a renovated space or a new space someday where exhibits would be a big priority. Another venture that we do to bring material into the public realm is that we have a series that's been launched recently called Archives Alive. And so some of our staff, our curators, will feature a particular collection, whether it's from our rare books, from the archives, and we'll do an evening presentation, or in the last year and a half, they've been virtual presentations, some of which have been attended by 300-400 people, talking about specific areas of our collection. So being able to show people things that, you know, you weren't able to do in the traditional sense of, you can only see it if you're a researcher. So we are trying to bring the collections out into the public more, and certainly, as we build our comics cartooning collections, we would want to do the same.
This is so important to me. I know that, Meaghan, you did it back in 2016 with that alter ego exhibit. This has to be part of archival work as well. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Me?
Yeah, on bringing stuff to the public.
Yes, yes, I enjoy doing that. I am sad that we can't do a comics exhibition every year. This is the problem with, you know, LAC has such big collections that it'll probably be a while before they want to do comics again, unfortunately. But I mean, there's all, you know, I think we can do social media posts, and yeah, I think there's lots of ways to get stuff out there. And I do think that's a really important function of our work. And for me, part of making things known is providing good descriptions and making those descriptions known as well, which like I said before, I think that very few people know that the Bell Features collection has been digitized. So yes, obviously I haven't done a great job of of making the description known, but yeah, library catalogs sometimes it's not always obvious, I guess, how to find, well, special collections. Anyway, I don't know. Was that a good answer? I think it was. Okay, well, because I think it's great. I think, and comics are so displayable, like they're so fun to look at, that, you know, this is an obvious thing. Yeah, and it was really fun. Like with Alter Ego, when it ran at LAC, it was in the lobby at 395 Wellington, so it was all reproductions. But the fun part about that was we got to blow everything up, and you know, we had like Mark probably remembers, we had a huge like cutout of Anglo-Man that was very fun, and we had Dixon of, yeah, we had Dixon of the Mounted as well, you know. So I think comics are so visual, there's so much potential to do that kind of work. So yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, it's very fun. It's a fun area.
I can add to that a little bit and say that my experience at Western is that we have great exhibit space on campus, and we utilize that exhibit space. We work with faculty members and students to create exhibits, but I think the campus exhibits prevent a lot of public from coming. I think having exhibits on campus are a real barrier. And so it is important to work with local museums. We work with Museum London, we work with Elgin Museum and other local galleries and museums to make sure that those exhibits are happening in public spaces that don't seem like such an exclusive place to have to conquer. So we try to do that, and we do it regularly locally. We also send our items all over the world. We've sent items to Australia and PEI recently. And I think the biggest thing for me is just the expertise that's needed to put on good exhibits. So I need to collaborate with local experts to do that, whether they are store owners or other academics or even just local collectors. I think for me, it's a little intimidating to create an exhibit of comic books for people who know comic books when I don't necessarily have that expertise. So the partnership is really important, and the public spaces are really important elements.
Can I ask Joe one quick question too before my last question? Joe, with the rise of digital work in the artist community, how open do you think galleries would be to displaying giclées instead of the originals? Is that a stage they're getting to?
We, in that exhibit, this is serious. We, Michael DeForge, who's a very important young cartoonist, works entirely digitally. So we did some prints of his work. I wanted to show more of his comics, and they just weren't available. We also showed things on video screens that you could scroll through. I photographed people's sketchbooks, and we had it so you could virtually, the sketchbook was on display and you could virtually flip through it on an iPad in front of it. So they were open to the idea. They gave us pretty much free range. So I think there is something magical about original, as Meaghan was saying, the whiteout, the paste ups, the yellowing of if there's letraset on it, the overlays, all of this stuff is like, I go crazy looking at this stuff. Like it's always amazing to me, and the notes on the back of it. There's something really that everyone responds to looking at original comics art in a gallery setting or in an archive setting. And that's the other thing, like there's the Billy Ireland collection, which is really respected by cartoonists. Like to get your work in the Billy Ireland is like the big thing. And Karen Green's archives at Columbia, that's another one. Anyone would be glad to have their work in there. So I think if an institution can get a momentum going and get a few people in there that people would want to be in that company, that's the way to build the momentum to start doing it. And another thing I think Lucia mentioned was outreach, working with comics festivals, which the Billy Ireland does that with CSX, which is a newer comics festival. And they have artists doing tours of the archives, and they all have the white gloves on, and they all post it on Instagram. And it works really well in promoting the collection and also bringing awareness to the collection. So the cartoonists go, oh my God, they have, Waterston originals there. I would love for my work to be in the same place as that, So I think that's, all of those things are good ways to just bring awareness and I also think, I know that the logistics are probably important to have multiple places, not just in one location, but there's something about a giant repository of a collection of like, oh my God, they have, I think of like the Albright Knox Museum in Buffalo, and they have this modern art collection. It's small, but every piece they have every modern artist of import in the canon, and they have one of the best pieces by them. And it's just like whoever was doing that collecting was wise. Anyway, I just think that if an institution can gain a reputation and the trust of artists, that would help to get them to donate their work.
That's what one would hope, yes. And as a new collectors in this area, we were quite pleased that Hoche agreed to donate his early material to us, as I think it was Ivan mentioned earlier this morning. His Martin Luther King work is going to Billy Ireland, and our preference, and traditionally in archives, the way you work is, if you're dealing with the literary archive, your expectation is that you will acquire the entire archive of that author. And I think our approach maybe might have to be different for cartoonists. It just might not always happen that way. We have to be open to the material being maybe housed in different locations, because I've used the comparison with literary papers, but it's not a perfect comparison, because there's obviously a very artistic element to the cartoonist work that could be attractive to a gallery as much as to an archive. And if that's the case, it's not like all of Picasso's paintings are in one place. Obviously, they're everywhere, and so it might just turn out that way. However, what one hopes as well, and Joe, you alluded to this, in when a place does become established, and while we're not established as a center for comics and cartooning, we are very established as an archive, and but when you get a few collections, they can have a snowball effect, and that's what we're hoping with Hoche. I'll give you another quick example. One of our literary archives is that of Stuart McLean, the CBC personality and the creator of the Vinyl Cafe. As some of you might know, so we're not looking to acquire commercial illustrations, but the Vinyl Cafe books and CDs, the artist who created did the artwork for those books has donated his work in that regard to us. So all of the Vinyl Cafe artwork is now with us. That artist, it doesn't hurt that artist happens to be Seth. So we're very pleased to have that component of Seth's archive with us. and so we, as I said, we hope that momentum builds and collections build as the word gets, as the word gets around.
Let me see. Matthew, I'm sorry, I did see you had asked if you could talk about crowdfunded comics. Do you still want to do that?
Sure, I can do that. So I think this is an area that libraries really need to do more work into, because so much stuff is getting published through crowdfunding platforms right now, and libraries cannot acquire it through their traditional means because it's not going through distributors. It's going directly to consumers, and you're not going to be able to. You might be able to find it at a convention, but you're not even going to be able to find it in a store. So I co-wrote a book chapter that was supposed to come out this fall from a book from the association. I can never remember what ACRL stands for. The American Association of College and Research Libraries. The book's called Comics, Books, Special Collections, and the Academic Library. And so it is all about, we did a survey of who is collecting crowdfunded comics through like platforms like Kickstarter and other platforms like that, and who is not, and what those reasons are. So I think this is something that if we really want to be developing collections of currently produced work, we need to look into different methods of purchasing material, because the stuff that is coming out now is not available through the ways that libraries have traditionally purchased material. So that's really it. This is just something that we need to talk about more, and we need to think about more. And you need to, if we're going to be developing collections of comics in our libraries, we need to reevaluate our methods of buying material. That's it.
Agreed. Yeah. Lucia, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, more than a response is just, I'm really glad that you're finally publishing that, Matthew, because I had a student at my course 3 years ago trying to kind of write a paper about the same thing, specifically looking at Kickstarter projects and see how libraries could access them. And in her case, even the small surveys that she did on her library system, in a public library system, to see how that could happen, what were the mechanisms that were already available that perhaps could accommodate those acquisitions. There were none. It was impossible. And the only solution that they were giving to her was the possibility of kind of the library having a visa to be able to kind of like do those purchase. It was because of the convoluted way that sometimes public libraries acquire materials, or the very restrictive ways that they can acquire materials. It was very hard to find an easy way to do those acquisitions. So I'm looking forward to read that chapter, Matthew.
I'll just say that I believe technically legal deposit does apply to crowdfunded materials. So I know that, yeah, LAC has received a couple, but anyways, okay, Candida has her hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention back to the comment about purchasing crowdfunded comics. I mentioned Camille Callison in the chat, and I've heard her give an excellent talk about the problems with the institutional barriers to acquiring Indigenous comics for a university library, because they cut her slush fund. So she had to be personally out of pocket going when she was meeting with band councils, buying their health education comics that they'd self-published, or going to the Indigenous Comic Con. And there's just no infrastructure for some libraries to buy these kinds of comics that don't come through the major distributors that the libraries have contracts with. So if we are looking at going beyond, established publishers to crowdfunded comics, or to things like Indigenous comics published by band councils, there have to be workarounds, and that can add a lot to the labor of the librarians and archivists who are trying to put the collection together. So I think it goes back kind of to a question that what Rick's been saying about having to be selective has made me just wonder this big question about, well, how do you decide which cartoonist archives you're going to gather, and all of the sort of scholarly stuff on archives that our institutions are forgetting as much as remembering because of the people who aren't included. And I know that's a huge conversation at the end of a panel, but I mean, really, how will we decide collectively as a community which cartoonists' works will be preserved and archived? And I would love to see some kind of principles, probably for another symposium, but coming together as a community and asking ourselves, what are the principles for archiving Canadian comics?
And I think this is one area where, Canada's tendency towards regionalism might actually work out kind of well if, BC-based cartoonist archives end up in BC, and Manitoba-based cartoonists end up Manitoba, etc. We have another question. I don't know, does anybody want to follow up on what Canada said, or we do have another question from Chris in the chat. And he asked, are there connections between Anglo-Canadian Glam and French-speaking Quebec Glam between libraries, for example? Is it Canadian including all Canadian libraries, or are there two associations, French and English? And I mean, I think there are connections, but I think generally it is pretty separate, although LAC, of course, is an officially bilingual institution and collect French and English material. Yes, I don't know, does anybody else have anything to say about,
Meaghan?
yeah, I was, yes.
Can I follow up? I'm sorry. Just
Yes.
when you said it, I was guessing that it was separated. I mean, but can you tell me if there is at least one person or two people who are supposed to establish connections between these two? I mean, it's kind of the same absurdity where, I mean, it's called Canadian and it's not Canadian since they separated. Is there anything that make them work together sometimes on some topics, or I don't know? It's weird.
I can speak to that for a second.
Yes, Mark.
I was, for most of my life an Anglo-Quebecer, although I'm in Ottawa now. And so I was kind of sometimes the token Anglo in the room in Quebec comics discussions. I was a member of the organization that existed, l'Association des créateurs de la bande dessinée, back in the day. So we tried to have connections. We made efforts. But they the two solitudes, myth kind of lived there, because comics are, Anglophone comics and Francophone comics are such completely different worlds already. They have different formats, different distributions, different audiences. So it was a kind of a difficult bridge to gap. It was a gap to bridge, I should say. So it exists, but I mean, in the comics book I published, I tried to include both. But again, we had problems of terminology, just discuss, because they were published in different formats. We had, it was very difficult to integrate them into the same, and to pretend they're the same is just deluding ourselves. They're very different and very, unique communities.
Mark, this is exactly, I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
But here I was asking, because that's what I'm studying now and with a group of researchers, but I mean, I was asking particularly about institutions, which, I mean, is called Canadian and therefore shouldn't be separated, or at least should have some connections.
I agree.
That's different. When you're talking about people, I mean, for example, if you're an Anglo-Quebec, and I understand that there are some issues, linguistics or whatever, but and I'm working on that. But here, to a precise question about institutions, I mean, it's obvious, for example, in the academic world. Also, I discovered that actually, to be frank with you, I'm not Quebecois. I have a French accent, but I'm not Quebecois. I feel Canadian from my heart, but I'm not Canadian. I'm from Belgium, a country where the separation between the two main communities is also extremely strong. And so I'm coming here, and that's why I'm interested in that issue, or that's also why. And so, is there an answer? Do you have liaison? I don't know if it's the correct word, but between the Francophone libraries, for example, and the Anglophone libraries in Canada?
There's very little communication between libraries in Canada to begin with, to be honest.
Yes, that's true.
Because there is no longer, as Amy just said in the chat, there's no longer a Canadian Library Association. It used to exist, and it was an organization that existed in Anglophone Canada and Francophone Canada, but it is not there anymore. There's currently the CFLA, the Canadian Federation of Library Associations, which has representatives from all provinces across Canada. The issue, and someone else can go into this as well, is there's just not a lot of libraries in Canada doing comic stuff. And so those conversations are not happening because any conversations are not happening, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think I might have said this before, but I work at Library and Archives Canada, which is formerly the National Library of Canada. We collect French and English, well, all Canadian materials. So, and I don't know if half the staff is Francophone, but certainly we have a Francophone a library cataloging team and an Anglophone library cataloging team now. So that's interesting as well, because they are separate teams. I mean, they know each other, but you know, they don't, there's people who work on the French material and there's people who work on the English material. Yes. I see, okay, sorry, there was a question from Jaylene who says, can libraries and archives publicize lists of items that they would like or need donors to collect and donate on their behalf? So I think this is a very interesting idea. I like the idea of working with collectors. Yeah, I think we should. I think if there are collectors out there who want to, you know, identify an institution where they'd like to see their collection go, you know, I think it's a great idea. I don't know if anybody else. Yes, Deborah.
I think that's also a really great idea. It's something I've been thinking quite a lot about. And as I mentioned, ever since Eddie donated his comic book collection to Western, I've had calls from local collectors saying, well, I heard that Eddie donated his collection, so now I want to donate my collection to Western as well. And I think it's really important because there comes a time where you're going to start to get duplicate material or material that's not in your mandate, and you're going to be saying no to these potential donors, which is going to be very disappointing. So if there are donors out there who feel like in the future, I do want to find a home for this material, I think it's really important to give them some guidance and to make it very well known what you would consider and what you wouldn't consider, so that there's not that disappointment at the end of the process. So I do think that people who are thinking about that should work with the places that they're thinking of donating, just to collaborate a little bit on what the possibilities are and what their mandates are. At least be familiar with that. Otherwise, and I come up against this every single day, you'd really disappoint people when they offer you material and you have to say no, and we have to say no a lot. So I think it's a key aspect of having a clear mandate that's public.
Yeah. Yeah, and a well-written collection development policy. Jillian, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to go one step further and say, not just sort of be there and available and waiting for the calls to come in, but to actually solicit and build relationships. Maybe that means working with the development people at your institution to start networking and treat it more like museums and other cultural institutions do, to get the support of the people of the means to do this. And it doesn't necessarily take the collector themselves. It just takes someone rich who needs a tax break. It really does. And they're looking for places to park their money. And so long as they're sold on it, they're good. They just need someone to be the matchmaker. But Canada's really bad at this because, hey, we don't have a culture of schmoozing like that. I mean, I've been working in the US for a while now, closely with the few archives, and I see more how it's done down here, and the tax structure is a little different. So the cultural practice around people making it part of their financial planning to decide where they're going to stick their tax donation stuff, you know, it's kind of on everyone's minds. They're already in the habit of doing it. And I just see that as an area of development that a lot of Canadian institutions and archives haven't tapped as much. So maybe we just need to get over our, you know, British colonial reticence about talking about money, and just start sucking it up and saying, you know, we need that stuff. You need the tax donation. Here's a collector who has stuff that we want, but is not in a position to take advantage of the tax break. So let's the three of us get together and make that all happen.
Maybe again, we see where this, you know, events like this symposium can come into it. If this is a networking event where, you know, hopefully we all meet each other and can start working together. Yeah. Does anybody else have anything on that? Oh, Eddie, yes, Eddie Smet, hello.
Hello. I guess listening to some of this, a couple of things. First of all, I was fortunate enough that I started donating my comic books 8-9 years ago when they weren't being wasn't that sort of the donations are going on. And at the time, the library really agreed to take whatever of my collection I was willing to part with. So they have not yet said no to me. And as a result, what they've gotten is actually a very eclectic mix. For example, I had a complete Conan, the comic Conan collection. Well, I also had the paperbacks. So I contributed both. And that's been going on all along. And for me, yes, I'm glad to have a tax donation receipt for it. But in the end, it wasn't the money that made me make the donation to Western. I've also I'm not collecting comic books anymore. There's no point to it. But getting back to how the library acquires things which don't come in a traditional form. If I see something, for example, Ivan's book, which was distributed, which was by crowdfunding, I made certain to buy a couple of extra copies, and I just simply added that to my collection. And so the next donation, it went in, and it's been going on. It's been going on like that. I don't know. I'm sorry I missed the early part of the talk, but I think I could probably pick it up on YouTube. For me, by the way, Deborah, I am in process of putting together another 500 comics, a donation. I've been donating for 8 or 9 years. It's like donating whatever I can tear apart from my heart, so to speak. And some of that is, for example, what you're going to be getting is a complete run of the Dell Indian Chief comics, which actually are very nice comics to portray the indigenous peoples in North America. I've got such an eclectic mix, and since the acceptance, so I've got a number of French comics like Isabella. You're probably not familiar with that, but it's kind of small form things. It's like adult comics, a little bit more. I think that the result is a lot of what's been talked about. I've had bits and pieces of. I never collected superheroes. I had bits and pieces of. So the library at Western has a fairly, from my collections, that I think is certainly fairly diverse thing. And I'm almost finished with my collecting, but I'm holding on to a couple of dozen comics, the ones that are most dear to me. Anyway, just a comment on some of the stuff that was being said. I'll keep quiet.
Thank you. It's great to see you here. And I was happy to see John this morning too. I think, two of the most notable donors of published comics in Canada for sure. Does anyone have any other questions or thoughts they want to get out? Anyone? Oh, yes, Deborah.
I'll just add one more thought coming to it as a special collections librarian at a large institution in Canada. I have to say that a conference like this is really important, and having academics really speaking up to institutions is really important, because it's just really not known yet the value of comics to academia, to teaching, and to research. And this is something that we have to make a much more clear to libraries and to universities. So there's work to be done to try and get some of the resources allocated to the library to support comics, whether it's cataloging or spaces or acquisition. These are challenges that I have, not necessarily because we don't have the ability or the desire, but we simply are competing for resources. This needs to be something that really is put in the forefront. So I think a conference like this is just a fantastic beginning to do that.
Yeah, agreed. Yes, Eddie again.
Just one comment as well. In terms of acquiring material, you may or may not be aware of, but the price of comics has just gone through the roof. I mean, if I'd hung on to my collection and tried to cash it in now, I'm sure it could get at least double or more than what it is, and that certainly means that collectors will be much less able to collect the older material.
Yeah.
I mean, if a comic book which is graded as 9.8 out of 10 goes from 15, 20 years ago, goes for $35,000, which is what's happening in some cases, that makes it very difficult.
Yeah, I think I've had that thought about John Bell too, that he donated his collection in the 90s. And I wonder what he would probably get a lot bigger tax receipt now, I think. Yeah.
It's what it is.
Yeah.
Look, I've got to admit that for me, my comic book collection was, when you have 10, 15,000 comics in an apartment, it's not only a collection, it's a curse in some ways. It's a real burden. And I must admit, one of the things really was I was very happy to donate it to a good home. And that's made it much easier. And I'm also at a point where I didn't need the extra cash. And I didn't know 10 years ago that comics were going to be that pricey. I mean, even now, my comic book, my Canadian comics from donated from a few years ago, they would now be bringing in a lot more if I sold them on the open market. But that's that's life. I couldn't hang on to them now. I couldn't deal with the burden. I still got 4,000 comics. Deborah, but you're not getting all of them. You're getting another 1,000. And the one thing also with when I collect, I was a completist. So Deborah, while I'm speaking to you, I will next year donate my classics illustrated, because I think that's one that people have. I should finally get to, because I still have a complete run, at least one of each, not necessarily
all the versions.
An original version, but more than half of them are originals, including some classics comics. And at that point in time, you'll have to wait till I die. Anyway, I'll shut up.
Okay, I see. We're almost out of time, I guess. But I see a comment here from Irene. We should also talk about archival/library resources for artists, such as image references for visual research, stylistic reference, anatomy references. That's an interesting point that I hadn't really thought about, but that is interesting. Like, brings to mind the idea of sort of artist in residence programs. If if somebody's writing a book about, I mean, we had. Oh no, now I'm blanking on his name. The Christie Pitts guy. Sorry. But yeah, if there's an institution that has a lot of archival material about a historical topic someone's writing about, then you bring them in, and maybe thank you, Jamie Michaels, that's a good way to make those connections as well. Kind of if everybody can help each other in this situation.
Those do exist. I have used online archives like McMaster University and LAC to help write research and get references for historical stories.
It's another good example of sort of synergy that I probably wouldn't have thought of. Okay, yeah, so I think we have about 4 minutes left. Does anyone have any sort of concluding thoughts or anything? No?
I think that we need money.
Yeah, well, that would be nice, yeah. Does anyone have $1 billion not using?
I mean, Jillian's point, it makes a great point, and I think I think in the end in Canada it would work very well with a government kind of like a cultural policy that recognizes the importance of comics and the importance of funding this kind of this type of projects and this kind of initiatives, and definitely look for those the ways to building up those networks and those collaborations between kind of what this conference is doing between practitioners, collectors, publishers, festivals, academic institutions, public libraries, archives. It makes things a little bit of a nightmare sometimes. So logistically, kind of like hard to make them happen. But I think for a country like Canada, that would be ideal from my point of view. And thank you everybody for like on the chat and hear what they've shared.
Yeah, thank you. I think, Deborah, you were saying earlier about the importance of demonstrating the value of comics for academic research, which is a good, important point, I think. But another thing about comics, right, is that they have that they're quote unquote sexy, right? They're fun. People want to hear about comics. People like comics. I think I would have to say the Bell Features collection, I'm pretty sure, is the most used material in LAC's rare book collection. And, that's pretty good. So we have that going for us. Sorry.
One of the things we're about to do at Western is I'll be chairing a working group to explore and make recommendations on how Western should continue to manage its comic book collection. So this is going to be a large project, and it's just, so far I haven't announced this. It's just been in discussion to get approval to create the working group. And yet all of a sudden I had a flood of emails from people across the system saying, can I please be on your working group, before it's even gone out to ask. So I think people are very excited about comic books, and I anticipate good things are going to be happening.
Well, that's a nice positive note to end things on, that everyone loves comics. I think that is true. And so, yeah, well, yeah, thank you very much, all of you, for participating today. I enjoyed this very much. Thank you. You're welcome. Yeah, so, okay, so Canada is pointing out in the chat, tomorrow we're starting at 11 Eastern time with our keynote between the aforementioned Ho Che Anderson and Cole Pauls. So that will be really great. Yeah, tomorrow looks to be another excellent day. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed today. It looks like everyone else did as well. So yeah, can't wait to see you all again tomorrow.
Bye all.
And, okay, thanks everybody. Have a good evening.
Bye everyone.